been a long time in America since we have seen any mainstream political brand advocating sharp cuts in government spending. Now that it's happening, the other side is squealing like a dying rabbit.
A substantial amount of the grift is going to be Republicans, and those Republicans are the ones who give the uniparty power.
I don't think we'll see any actual cut in government spending in 2025. Who could possibly be in favor of allowing men to compete with women in sports? It's complete insanity.
I think the single biggest story of the 2024 election was that mainstream media lost their power. If he succeeds at that, then the Democrat Party could just utterly implode. We could be looking at a pretty severe recession.
The European decision to move away from dense energy sources is truly one of the greatest delusions in history.
I think Europe is absolutely going to be gutted. If you own European stocks, I would be very, very careful about that.
Welcome to Financial Face-Off, where perspectives clash and insights thrive. With our host, Porter Stansberry, and his guest, Peter St. Onge, we'll break down the strategies shaping portfolios and help you make sense of the market chaos.
Peter, I got two big topics for you on this face-off, which is one, political. Are the changes that Doge are making and all of the heated rhetoric around access to the spending, is all that political theater, or will it have real impact in the economy? That's one. And number two, seems to me the economy is a lot stronger than anybody has forecast, and I want to talk about what that might mean for gold prices, for interest rates, and for stock prices. But let's start with the politics. It's been a long time in America since we have seen any mainstream political brand advocating sharp cuts in government spending. Now that it's happening, the other side is squealing like a dying rabbit. And I just wonder, is any of this going to make any difference? When we get to the end of this fiscal year, will there actually have been a net decrease in spending? And if so, what will the impact on the economy be?
Yeah, so Trump actually tried first time around. His very first budget proposed $350 billion in cuts. And at the time, that was something like 1/6, about 15% of government spending. It was a big deal. Congress shot him down, of course. He tried again and again. Up until COVID, every one of his budgets, he was proposing major cuts. Every time Congress shot him down and said they raised spending, of course. But there was something written online. It was Mike Solana, and he said that, when you look at the Trump presidency this time, it's like he played a video game. He got to the final boss battle. He got killed in the boss battle. And now he's reset to like a previous save point, and he knows where all the boss battles are.
He's respawned.
Right? He knows how to defeat him. That's exactly it, right? Yeah. He's respawned halfway through the game. So when you see him playing at this time, he is so much better, right? He's got people he can count on. He's got the lawfare already queued up. Doge, what they did with Doge, right, which is repurposing an Obama creation. All they did was renamed a little piece of it. Obama created that because you remember back, the Obamacare website was such a mess. It was really embarrassing. It was making Big Mike look bad. So he created this U.S. digital service that had like plenary authority to go through the entire government and fix all the IT so that they were never going to have another embarrassing Obamacare. All Trump did was repurpose that. It's got existing budget, right? It had existing authorities. It could look at everything. I mean, he's just been absolutely playing the lawfare game masterfully, right? Last time they ran circles around him. This time he's running circles around them. So between Trump, I think instinctively always wanting to cut budget, it's just Congress got in the way. Between that and just he's playing the game on such a higher level, a lot of it thanks to Elon, who I think is absolutely brilliant by all accounts. Whether you like him or not, the guy is absolutely brilliant. I think that we actually stand a chance of cutting through this. Now, you've got two challenges, right? One of them is the lawfare. That's really what the Democrats are going with right now. Democratic politicians have been absolutely nowhere. You're hearing this on the Democrat side, that people are like, where are our politicians? Who is fighting this? However, they're relying on the judges, right? So you've got all these little kind of Hawaii judges who are blocking things here and there. So that's really one side of it. And then the other sort of resistance to it is, of course, going to be Congress. So we already know that a lot of the Democrats are on the payroll, whether it's U.S. aid or other parts of government. There are going to be Republicans on the payroll as well, right? Whether it's 20% or 10%, a substantial amount of the grift is going to be Republicans. And those Republicans are the ones who give the uniparty power, right? They are the swing vote that, even if the Democrats don't quite have a majority in Congress, they can get various critters. Guys like Lindsey Graham who get $90 million for his Democracy Institute. You've got dozens of those guys. And so once it looks like Doge is really going to cut major spending, which I think it's absolutely aiming for, those guys are going to rear their heads. And at that point, the question is, what are they going to try to defend? Now, if it's $100 billion in wasted Social Security payments to people who don't exist, I can't see a big constituency for that. So we could get those kinds of cuts. That could be 300, 500 billion. The embarrassing stuff, the transgender operas and all that, the question is who's going to stand up for that? Congress wants to because they're getting kickbacks on all that, right? But the question is really going to be public opinion. So I think that right now, that's what the Democrats are waiting for. They need to see more polls. They are not sure if Americans are on their side or if they should just kind of kick back and let a lot of this stuff happen. Because you want to keep in mind, if these guys fight the transgender operas in what was it? Peru was the transgender comic book. If Democrats fight that and they lose public support and then they lose next time around, well, if they're out of office, they're not going to get any grift, right? So they might like to keep all their grift, but depending how the American public looks at that, they may have to let some of that go in order to hold on to what they've got.
So, yes or no, do you think that we'll see an actual decline in federal government spending in 2025?
I think we will see actual cuts. The betting markets are saying 250 billion is very high odds. 500 billion, I think, is a stretch. 1 trillion if everything absolutely goes right for us. Now, of course, a lot of things grow in the background. Things like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, those grow in the background. So if we're just looking at 50 billion cuts, it might end up being flat. But if we can get to those 500 or 1 trillion, I think there's some chance of that. I would put it 1 in 4 or less. But if we can get to those major kinds of cuts, we could actually see government spending decline, which would be the first time since Bill Clinton.
No, I'll take the over on that. I don't think we'll see any actual cut in government spending in 2025. I think we've got a chance at a decline in government spending in 2026, but no chance in 2025 is my bet. In regards to the politics of it all, the thing that I am so struck by is the increase in apparent competency. Now, I don't know many of these people personally, but the ones that I do, like Vivek, he's obviously incredibly competent. Elon, obviously incredibly competent. Scott Bissett, I don't know him, but certainly comes across as eminently competent. I don't know anything about the defense secretary, but I love watching him going out and doing PT at 5 a.m. with the troops. Like that's a leader. And then the one part of the administration who I just think has the greatest advantage over her predecessor is the press secretary. I don't know the young woman's name, but she is just absolutely fierce and smart and on point, and she dogs all those idiot journalists like every single day. She dogs them harder and harder. It's great to watch. It's the opposite of the last administration. And so I think that this administration is going to surprise people by becoming more popular. And this is a really hard bet to make in politics, but I think they're going to see an increase in their majorities in the House and the Senate in the midterm elections, which never happens. But I think that, I just think that the incompetency of the last administration is just being demonstrated in such high resolution that there is no way the Democrats can say, oh yeah, those are good ideas. Think about the signing of the No Men and Women's Sports Act. I mean, talk about absolutely great optics for the President of the United States to be surrounded by young, athletic women and standing up for their ability to compete amongst women, which is simply the most basic idea that any American can possibly imagine. Who could possibly be in favor of allowing men to compete with women in sports? It's complete insanity, and that is the defining characteristic of the previous administration. So, but with all of that said, I think that all is just simply political theater, and that the real essence of government is always to hold power and to grow the power. And I think that you will see this group of Republicans do the same thing that the Ronald Reagan Republicans did, which is say that, oh, that Jimmy Carter was terrible and incompetent, and we're going to cut government. Oh, but not really. We're going to grow government massively. We're just going to grow it in a way that's competent that the American people will support.
Yeah, so you've got two sort of sides or two motivators for politicians, right? One of them is ideology, in theory, and then the other one is self-interest, corruption. And on the ideology side, I think the most exciting thing about politicians is that the vast majority of them have absolutely no spine. They believe nothing. And usually people say that, right? Usually people are like, this is so terrible. We need politicians who believe things. But keep in mind, there is a bright side to that, which is that Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, these people don't believe anything. Meaning that ideologically, they won't stand in your way. Not for ideological reasons. They'll get up and give beautiful speeches, but they don't believe any of that garbage. So that brings us to the other side, which is the self-interest, the corruption. And the trick here is to make it worth their while. And it can be worth their while because they feel so much threat, and so again, it goes back to public opinion, right? If the public is angry about all this government waste, and, they're just queuing them up, right? You had the $59 million for the luxury hotels for migrants in New York, while all these people in, North Carolina are living in tents. I mean, you've just got endless fodder here to keep the public interested in this stuff. Mainstream media, I think the single biggest story of the 2024 election was that mainstream media lost their power, right? They were talking about German dictators. That used to be taboo, right? You couldn't just, throw that out willy-nilly. They were talking about that nonstop 24/7. It did not work, right? So in the old days, you had all these embarrassing things. You had the luxury hotels, the transgender comics, and the media would hide all that stuff. I think those days are over. So at this point, Washington still sort of structurally has this left-wing bias, I think because traditionally they've been terrified of the left-wing media who could filter everything that was actually happening. So, for example, there was government shutdown. It was always the Republicans who were causing it, right? That's what the media would do. And I think that we're in a brand new world now where, on the one hand, media's lost its power. It's not terrifying the way it used to be for Republicans, for example. On the other hand, Elon Musk is kind of terrifying for them, right? He has endless resources. He's been very clear that any Republican who doesn't play ball, who carries water for the deep state, he's going to go after them. He's going to primary them. He's absolutely got the resources to knock these guys out. So I think the power dynamics in Washington have changed in a lot of ways where the traditional power brokers, namely the media, the deep state, all these people getting money, and then laundering it back to Democrats, they've lost power, and we've got a new bunch of guys now. We've got the alt media, we've got Elon Musk, we got some of these Silicon Valley guys who are joining in with him. I think that we're really at an inflection point, and the question is, are we looking at the 1980s where you had a lot of change, but like you say, there were a lot of sort of swamp creatures who, it ended up looking a lot more like continuity. Are we in the 1980s or are we in the 1930s? Okay, are we at a moment where people are so upset at the direction of the country where they are willing to accept very, very radical change so that we are going to get maybe not a total FDR, but something in that direction?
I think Trump has an interesting litmus test when it comes to the New York City mayor issue. Eric Adams is a very corrupt mayor. He's surrounded himself with gang members and, nonsense. And he's facing indictment, and Trump has just rescinded that indictment, and that may allow Eric Adams to win the Democratic primary for the mayoral election in June. If he's in that race, instead of in jail, he has a better chance of winning. And I wonder, is that happening because Trump believes that Eric Adams can be an effective political ally, or is that happening because Trump believes that a Republican can win the mayoral election in New York City, and that Eric Adams will be easier to beat than a Whitney Tilson or one of the other people who are also running?
Yeah, I mean, my general sense of Trump is that he's not that tactical. He doesn't necessarily, so on something like that, he would not sort of befriend and support a guy just because he thinks he's weaker. It just doesn't seem his style.
No,
so
I
I think honestly, he thinks there's overlap, that they can work together, and he wants to bring him on. I mean, one of the trademarks of Trump has been bringing on sane Democrats. Bringing on relatively centrist Democrats. That was one of the memes when he won, right? They had a picture of Tulsi, RFK, Elon, and Trump, and it said the Democrats won.
Yeah.
Right. It's a true story, right?
Yeah.
All these people were lifelong Democrats, including Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. He was briefly a Republican, but most of his life he was a Democrat. So I think he sees part of his coalition as being peeling off sane Democrats. I think that's part of why he won 2024. There were a lot of Black and Hispanics. I think he got within 5 points with Hispanics, which is shocking, right? Hispanics had been our entire lives. They had been just absolute Democrat base. So he's doing that. He's peeling them off. If he succeeds at that, then the Democrat Party could just utterly implode. They're losing their base, the sort of old Democrat base of working class, Rust Belt, blue collar, Catholics. They're losing all that base, and I think Trump is just going after them, as hard as he can.
All right. Well, let's start talking about the markets after the politics. If Trump isn't able to cut the budget in a material or meaningful way, then it seems to me that it's very likely the American economy is going to be much stronger than people were expecting. And instead of a soft landing, we may in fact have no landing. And I would point to the very strong results we've seen at the casual restaurants in the last quarter. Restaurants like Chili's and Texas Roadhouse, these Olive Garden, these stocks are all breaking out to huge new highs for the first time in a long time, 7 or 8 years. So a lot of consumer demand. And gold, of course, is now up 46% over the last year, which is more than stocks. Another sign of a strong economy, strong inflation. My concern about all of this is a strong economy can support higher interest rates, but can Bank of America's balance sheet survive higher interest rates? I guess the answer is yes. They'll find one way or another to bail them out. But I wonder if you could see a very strong economy, but have a very weak stock market. Because if we get economic growth at 4%, and you've got inflation running at even just a 2.5%, that gets you to 6.5% yields on the 10-year. And it's hard for you to imagine stock market trading at 25 times earnings with 6%, 7% interest rates. I just can't imagine that. Could we be back in the 1970s where we have high inflation, high economic growth, and very low stock multiples?
Yeah, it strikes me as conceivable. I think you're right that there's a good chance that we're going to get no landing here. I think the biggest sort of downsides to GDP anyway are going to be government spending if they succeed at that, and also mass deportation. Now, both of those are sort of paper factors, right? So GDP mechanically, it counts government spending, which strikes me as crazy because government spending is a cost. It's not, productive economic output. But if you cut $1 trillion in government spending, that will mechanically reduce your GDP by $1 trillion, which is close to 4%. That's a chunk of change. That would be one of the worst recessions that we've seen, I think, in our lives. is similar with mass deportation. So if you kick out 5 million people, that's about 1.5% of the population. They're low income, yes, but they do spend. So again, right, you've got a couple of factors where you're increasing national wealth in both cases. So these are good things to do, right? You do want to reduce government spending, which is wasteful. You do want to kick out the unproductive illegal migrants. But in sort of a pure, kind of paper recession sense, you put those two together and you can get quite a recession. And that could hit certain parts of the market, right? So illegal immigrants, for example, they probably disproportionately go to Walmart, go to maybe even casual dining, but certainly fast food. So you could see a number of especially consumer outlets that are getting hit by that. If government spending is going down, then you've got certain sectors that are hit by that. Hopefully, dare we dream, military contractors. But there are other industries that more or less survive on government money.
Yeah,
I know. now we're really dreaming.
Dare we dream? Yes.
But, right. So if we're trying to cut, let's say $1 trillion of spending, and we're trying to kick out whatever 5 million people, we could absolutely, we could have an economy that is going gangbusters. In other words, it's got tons of investment. Maybe the tariffs work as leverage, and we get a lot of new factories being built. So in other words, the sort of economic fundamentals would be extremely strong, and yet the GDP could actually be substantially negative. In a sense, I think that gives us like the anti-70s, where there were periods in the 70s where the economy appeared to be quite strong, but the underlying fundamentals were just rotten. And I think that we would almost get the opposite of that, where from the top down, the economy would look extremely weak. Have all these laid off government workers, but the fundamentals in terms of building for the future would be very strong. So one of my favorite books that I think sort of spells this out, it's called The Forgotten Depression by Jim Grant. You're probably familiar with it.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And it's talking about the 1919 recession. Mm-hmm. So that was coming out of World War I. World War I was tons of war spending. When that ended, you then had this massive retrenching the government. That caused a tremendous drop in GDP. It caused tremendous deflation as steel prices went down. The prices of almost every commodity went down.
Agricultural prices collapsed.
And of course, what happened at that time? Sorry?
Agricultural prices collapsed. Yeah. The total farm revenue went from something like 25 billion all the way down to like 12 billion.
Yeah.
And that ironically led to the first real big national tariffs. I think they were the Fordney and Macomber tariffs, and they were enacted in 21, 22 timeframe, and that set the stage for later for the more famous tariffs in the 1930s that people blame on creating the Great Depression. But it was interesting because those tariffs started on agricultural products in the early 20s, 22 in particular, and there was like a 40% tariff on agricultural goods. And of course, that didn't help the farmers at all. they had a Great Depression long before anybody else. But it's just a good history lesson around tariffs. But you were saying about the forgotten depression of 19 and 20. Sorry, just right into the tariffs.
Right. So what was fascinating there is that on the surface, the economy was in dire straits. Right? You had something like 8% GDP collapse. I mean, it was just dramatic. But it was for a good reason. It was because the economy, was shifting from producing guns to go send to Belgium and blow up to producing butter. And so we could be in a situation like that. Now, the key in 1919 was that the government didn't do anything about it. Right? The government did not try to stop the recession. Now, the reason for that was that President Wilson was sick and his wife didn't really, she kind of didn't have confidence, so she didn't do anything. So we got really lucky. But the question is, if we were to have a recession at this point that was caused by slashing government spending and deporting illegals, would the Trump administration be able to do nothing, right? Would it be able to just, let unemployment benefits do their thing, let sort of automatic triggers do their thing for people who are hurting, but aside from that, to do nothing? That would be a break from really about 50 years of government mismanagement of recessions, right? Where every time we have a recession, the government breaks something else on the road to, trying to dull the pain from the recession. So we could be looking at a pretty severe recession because of those things. However, for good reasons, for productivity enhancing reasons. And then if Trump were to sort of sit back and not try to break anything structurally, then on the other end of that, we could see, I mean, if you look at 1919, we had about a decade of outrageous growth. It was actually too fast, it turned out. We learned in 1929, but that was arguably the greatest decade for economic growth for the U.S. Now, in terms of stocks, that would suggest that if you're going to get a pretty severe recession because of slashing government spending and mass deportations, yes, you would have a pretty severe dip in a lot of prices. But if the government is not doing anything, right? In other words, if there is this glorious promised land on the other side of that, then that would be the absolute buying opportunity of the century to jump in there and try to get those low ratio stocks and then just sit back.
Well, Peter, I love that forecast, but I'm gonna continue to vote and to bet on the government not cutting spending. I think they will have a stronger than anticipated economy. I think we're going to have higher than anticipated inflation, and I think you're going to have lower than expected stock multiples. So I still think that at some point in the next 18 to 24 months, you're going to have a big repricing of equity. You just can't have equity trading at over 20 times earnings, even if earnings growth is 6 or 8 or 12%, with bond yields, 10-year yields at 7% or 8%. You're gonna have to have a repricing. And I don't think that there are many investors who are still around from the late 80s, early 90s, where interest rates were commonly above 7%. So I think it's just going to be a shock to a lot of investors to see that kind of environment. So that's my call for now, that it's not a hard landing, it's not a soft landing, it's a not landing. But I, of course, hope that you're right. Let's see. If I had told you a year ago that gold was going to be up 46% and that central banks all around the world were going to be buying more gold than they had in 50 years, you probably would have said, that's not likely. That can't be the consensus case outlook. What have you got? What's the surprise going to be? If gold has been the surprise for the last, say, year or two, what's the surprise? What are people like you and me who should see these trends growing? What's the big shock that's gonna happen for us over the next 12, 18 months? What are we missing right now?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right about gold. If you had told me that, then I would have said the only way that is possible is if we maintain double-digit inflation all the way through, right? In fact, inflation is still high, but it's about 3%.
Yeah,
right? It's not 10%.
It's moderated a great deal.
It has. And so to see gold doing what it's doing right now in that context, I think is absolutely shocking. It suggests, given that a lot of the demand is coming from central banks, it suggests that central banks all around the world are concerned. The question is, are they concerned about broad inflation, which is normally what, pumps up gold, or are they concerned with what is the major competitor to gold, which is the US dollar? Right, so that's something that I've talked about frequently, where the sanctions that were done against Russia, right, so namely the US seized Russia's central bank dollars, and that had been very taboo. That was never done. It was not done during the Cold War. It was not done with any country we went to war with, because the US was run, or US currency policy was run by adults who understood that you want the rest of the world to be dependent on you. And they broke that taboo with Russia. And the issue isn't so much Russia's dollars. I think Russia's got 400, 600 billion. It's a chunk of change for the Russian economy. But the larger issue is that put the entire world on notice that dollars are not good as gold, right? Dollars are only as good as your relationship with the US president today. And, Biden had shown that he was already, or Biden's handlers, that he was already willing to break that. I think Trump is even more scary for most countries, right? So if Biden has crossed that bridge of seizing everybody's dollars, it's very credible that Trump, will have a bad meeting with Justin Trudeau and terrible things could happen. So I think that in many ways, the world is turning from the dollar, not necessarily even because of inflation, which has come down so much, but sort of the imperialism of U.S. policy is gutting the dollar. And Trump himself has been funny on the dollar, because sometimes, he and J.D. Vance have both mused in many interviews how they would like the dollar to be weaker because they want to subsidize American exports. But at the same time, there was talk about BRICS a couple weeks ago, and Trump said he's going to put a 100% tariff on anybody who joins the BRICS currency. So it's kind of like, which is it, right? Do you want to, are you trying to maintain the strength of the dollar? Or are you trying to intentionally weaken the dollar? People are talking about a Plaza Accord 2.0, where the U.S. kind of jawbones or strong arms all these other countries into making the dollar weaker. So I think that that's going to be a major question for the next year. Tariffs, of course, are going to play into that massively, right? Generally, tariffs strengthen the dollar. They weaken the opposing country. When Trump threatened his 25% tariffs on Canada, for example, the Canadian dollar absolutely plunged. I think it was like 8 or 10%. Yeah, like essentially half of those tariffs were going to be immediately paid by erosion in the Canadian dollar, which of course is terrible for Canadians because now they have to import all their stuff at higher prices. But I think that the dollar is going to be an absolute shock for people. I think there's sort of been a lazy assumption that Republicans are good for the dollar. I think Trump, given those policy dynamics, I think that could really be a shock to the system. That would benefit gold, but it would have, it would impact equity markets. It would, of course, impact the American economy.
Okay.
You could conceivably see financial crises in third world countries, right? So a lot of them, depending on what happens to the dollar, in some countries, a lot of their assets are in dollars. In other countries, a lot of their debts are in dollars. So if the U.S. dollar is in play, that then sets up a potential wider crises all over the world.
All right. My surprise for the next 12 to 18 months is unprecedented, crazy, never seen before growth and electrical demand that will mostly be fueled by natural gas. I think you're going to have double-digit prices for natural gas. Of course, natural gas is one of the most volatile commodities in the world, so you've seen lots of natural gas spikes over time. But I think you'll see consistently higher natural gas prices and double-digit natural gas prices that remain elevated because of soaring demand for baseload, all the time on power, and of course, fueling massive build-out in data centers globally.
I think you're absolutely right on that. That's a great call. The AI has trumped the green lobby, and they are just, it's astounding how much energy those things use. I read somewhere like one prompt uses as much as like an American household uses in a week or something. I mean, it's just a shocking amount of electricity that these things use. And they're all connected, right? Every major country in the world is trying to promote its national champions and become, the center of AI. And so they're not even taking the phone calls from the Greens anymore.
No. And I do think that the European decision to move away from dense energy sources is truly one of the greatest delusions in history. And if that wasn't a Russian propaganda campaign, if that wasn't, the Russian misinformation, it surely should have been. I mean, it's hard to believe that the Russians weren't underwriting the entire green revolution in Europe. Well, listen, Peter, it's always great to talk with you. Any final thoughts before we go our separate ways?
Well, I was going to say Europe is a fascinating story. When we talk about Trump's tariffs, right, you've got two angles to that. One of them is leverage to kind of push countries into taking our exports. But another side of it is this genuine attempt to bring industry back into America. And, a lot of people laugh at this because they say, well, Chinese costs are X, Y. No, but Europe is wide open. So I think that could be a big surprise over the next couple of years. If Trump lowers taxes, he lowers regulations, if it is genuinely more attractive to produce in America, I think Europe is absolutely going to be gutted. If you own European stocks, I would be very, very careful about that. I think Europe's going to be sort of a fascinating story over the next 2 years. They're terrified of what Trump is doing, by the way. They've got all these speeches and conferences on how to raise competitiveness. And of course, their conclusion is we need more government planning. So it ain't going to work.
No, it's not going to work. Not a good day to be a Volkswagen shareholder, that's for sure. All right, well, great. We'll look forward to talking with you again next month. Thank you, Peter.
Absolutely. Looking for a report.